Hi, everyone. I hope you all had a good lunch. I figured since even the last class was after lunch, it's probably a good idea to recap a little bit, at least, so you just to remind you what we did last time. So if you remember, we had talked about various properties of real networks that people studied in the late 90s, early 2000s, and found fairly surprising. And amongst those properties were the degree distribution. So and we said that for many real networks, they turned out to have fat tails. We looked at something called the clustering coefficient, and that was quite high. And we looked at the diameter and said that was generally quite small. Right? Everybody remember what these quantities were? The degree distribution, the degree is just how many nodes are coming in or out of a link. So if it's an undirected graph, that's very straightforward. It's just how many links there are to that node. If it's a directed graph, you have to distinguish between nodes that are coming in and nodes that are going out. And sometimes that can be different. The degree distribution of in-degrees, incoming links may be different from those of outgoing links. But in other networks, it's not. But in general, anyway, those degree distributions tend often to have fat tails. That is, they fall off with degree. For large degree, they fall off slower than exponentially, sometimes even as a power law, sometimes even slower than that. The clustering coefficient was something to do with about if you have various neighbors, if this is the node we're interested in, and it has many neighbors, what is the chance that those neighbors are themselves connected? It could be that some of them are connected, but some others may not be. Maybe these two neighbors are not connected. So how many of your friends know each other? Something like that. And generally, we found that real networks had a pretty high fraction of this clustering. The diameter was something to do with the shortest paths. And in particular, it was the longest, shortest path between pairs of nodes. Another quantity that's very similar is the average path length. And in general, it turns out that for many of the networks we'll study, like the random graphs that we looked at, these quantities scale in the same way, at least as with the size of the network. So sometimes when people have studied these in real networks, sometimes they looked at this, sometimes they looked at this. But in any case, things were small. And then we talked about how, we need to understand what is small, what is high, and have a good set of things to compare with. And we talked about Erdos-Renyi random graphs. Okay? And so let me do one thing. I looked up a few real network numbers. So let me begin with by giving you some sense of what actual numbers showed up for some of these networks. So let me actually do that over here. So these numbers that I'm going to show you, come from a review. So let me say networks references here. I will put these up on the website also. I'll give it to the organizers to put them up. But this is a review by Albert and Barabasi. So some of the numbers come from this. This is a little bit old. It's a 2002 review, but it has a whole lot of numbers for a whole lot of different networks. So it was kind of convenient to have it in one place. But some of the numbers I'll give you are actually from a paper I've just reviewed. So just to give you a sense that people are still working on networks. And you still get research papers on networks. And in particular, biological networks are still very, very exciting and very interesting. So people are still studying those. So some of the networks for biology that I'll give you are actually even unpublished or about to be published numbers. So from that, these guys studied the World Wide Web. And I'll give you just a sense of the number of nodes and the diameter and the clustering coefficient, okay? So they looked at a portion of the World Wide Web. They didn't look at everything, but they sampled some of it, and they sampled about 150,000 nodes. And the diameter turned out to be, in this case, around 4, and the clustering coefficient was around 0.1. Sorry, yes. Yeah, yes. I'm sure, yeah, it probably does. It's probably also a lot smaller than the No, of course. I mean, the actual N for the World Wide Web, even forget the dark net, just the normal light net, is much larger than that. Now, these are also old numbers from 2002. But it's just to give you a sense of what are these values, because I was kind of vague and saying just high and small. So I wanted to give you some real values. Don't take these values as sacred. People are still working on the World Wide Web, updating their idea of what the network looks like. And so do look up more recent papers and more recent values, but just this is just to give you a sense of the range of numbers, okay? Okay, so that was one. That was like a World Wide Web. People looked at an interesting network, which was the co-authorships in a particular branch of mathematics, I think. I forget. You can look at the review and figure out what this co-authorship network was. But it was basically a bunch of mathematicians who had written, lots of papers together, and they were linked if they were co-authors on at least one paper. And this had a rather large number of nodes. And the, hang on, where is the, yeah, this was about something like 10. And the clustering coefficient was something like 0.4. So notice, I mean, later on we'll talk about, I'll remind you again of what results we got for the Erdos-Renyi. But the fact that this is larger than this, but that's smaller than that, I haven't actually told you what the connectivity is like, okay? What is the average degree per number? So per node. So it's certainly possible for large networks to have a smaller diameter than a smaller network because, hey, it may be just more dense, more links around. You can find the actual link numbers and the average degree numbers also in that review. Yeah. Largest, shortest path. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that was part of the point of, why is it so small? No. In the World Wide Web, consists of basically pages, which consists of hypertext, and the links are hypertext links. And this is a certain portion of the World Wide Web they looked at. And in that thing, you could reach anywhere in 4 steps. I think if you look at the World Wide Web now with a much larger, the World Wide Web is a lot bigger than this in reality. So if you look at a much larger thing, of course the diameter goes up. But the question is, actually, the real interesting question is, how does it scale? So this was a small portion of the web they looked at. It had 4. If you now go out to the biggest, include the whole World Wide Web, of course the diameter is much larger, but not much larger. It's sort of, I don't remember what the latest numbers on the World Wide Web are. We can try and look it up, maybe in the tutorial, or between now and the tutorial, we can look up some recent papers on World Wide Web and update those. Okay? But it actually turns out, I will just mention that, but since you brought it up, it turns out that this number is very well explained by the Erdos-Renyi calculation, which I will come to in a second. Okay? So it's actually not that surprising, even if you assume the World Wide Web was just a random graph of the type we talked about. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And which is why at that time, which is, I guess, 2002, they didn't have a crawler that really crawled very far. So the tricky part of that is to just make sure you are sampling properly in most of these cases. So a crawler is a perfectly reasonable way to crawl various web pages. And then you kind of decide where to truncate. So most of the questions are about where to truncate. In this case, I think what happened is they picked websites with within a certain subject topic range, okay? And they delimited it using that criterion. So it's a particular way of taking out a subgraph of the World Wide Web. In other cases, like the co-author thing, essentially you need some kind of public database that has the list of all papers and all their authors. Such databases do exist now. For instance, you could go to archive.org and you could actually get information from them about all the papers in archive.org and who are the co-authors. And then the only question that you have to worry about, and this is a very sensible, practical problem, is what if the author names are slightly different? You know, in one place it might be S. Krishna, in one place it might be Sandeep Krishna. People deal with these kind of things. So actually getting these numbers is sometimes a tricky job. You're absolutely right. And each type of network and each type of database from which you get these data will have its own little problems. And one will have to deal with that. So maybe as I write down various things, I'll tell you to the extent I know how they found this out. One very interesting one is there is a worm called C. elegans. And this is one of the biological organisms whose neural network has been entirely mapped. So they know exactly how many neurons there are, which neuron connects to which neuron, and everything. And this is roughly on the order of 300 nodes. And here the diameter was around 3, and here this was around 0.3. Okay, so we've had a couple of social networks, a brain. There was some food webs that have been looked at. So these are ecological networks where nodes are species and interactions are, you know, predator-prey links, who eats who, type of stuff. So this particular one I'm talking about was a lake, I believe, somewhere in the US. And this was also around something like this, and 0.2. Yes, this is directed. So let's see. This is directed. This is undirected. Yeah, okay, I'll use arrows to show directed. This is directed. This is directed. Okay, so, I mean, this is just to give you a sense of the kinds of numbers that can arise. And really, we need to understand, are these numbers large or small, and so on, right? You have an intuitive sense of whether they're large or small, but especially with the clustering coefficient, sometimes it's not so easy to think. So let's think about the Erdos-Renyi graphs. So we had said, if you remember, let me write down Erdos-Renyi graphs here. This was a Poisson distribution. Yes, everyone remember? We will talk about the limit where n goes to infinity, p goes to 0 in such a way that pn is a constant, which is the average degree. If you remember, pn was the average degree of nodes in the Erdos-Renyi graph. So because it's the average degree, I'm just going to write it like that. This is a constant. So in this limit, things were rather easy to calculate. And we had shown that the distribution is Poisson, so it's certainly not factorial. So this does not really match. The clustering coefficient we had said was p, right? Which in this limit would be something like k by n. So it goes as 1 over n. The diameter, we had said, goes as something very close to log n by log k. These were the results we had got, if you guys remember from yesterday. And I'll tell you, I'll just state it, that if you look at the diameters that you get here, and if you know n, and if you know average k, which I have not, sorry, unfortunately written down here, but you can find it from the review. And if you calculate log n by log k, it turns out to be very close to this, statistically close enough. Note that in this kind of situation, you can not only find out the degree, the diameter, but also the fluctuations in the diameter, right? This diameter value that we've got is actually the average diameter for a Erdos-Renyi graph with n nodes and degree k. You can also equally find out the standard deviation and so on. So taking all that into account, this actually is explained very well. All of these numbers are pretty close to what you would expect if you're taken all those links that these had and just thrown them randomly amongst the nodes. No, so it depends. I mean, different ones of them do have different Ks. So of course, the K for this is different from the K for this. That's why this actually matches. Oh, in this limit, no. So I am taking precisely the limit. Yes, this is just log n. Yes, it still diverges, absolutely. It still diverges, but very, very slowly. So small, only small in the sense that it does not scale as n, or as a power of n. It's only small, it's not small in the sense that the diameter remains finite while the size. So thanks very much. That's a very worthwhile point making. We are in a limit, so for Erdos-Renyi networks, as you take this n going to infinity limit, the diameter does diverge, but it just diverges very, very slowly, okay? In this limit. The clustering coefficients, on the other hand, in all of these cases, are really, really low. Which was this, the World Wide Web, right? This is something like 10 to the minus 4. This is the expected one from the Erdos-Renyi. This one is something like 10 to the minus, they're all 10 to the minus something. Where's the co-author one? Yeah, 10 to the minus 5, 10 to the minus, this is one of the largest ones. This is 0.05, but statistically still significantly different from this. And the last one was the food web, and that's also 0.05. But in all these cases, all of them were statistically significantly much lower than the measured value. So it's in that sense that we kind of say that the values measured for the real networks are high. They're high relative to the Erdos-Renyi expectation. Now we have to think about, so obviously, okay, I mean, so far all we have really concluded is that real networks are not random in the sense of Erdos-Renyi. That's not really surprising. Many of these networks, some of them have clearly evolved under complex selection pressures over billions of years. Some of them have other kinds of processes that have led to co-authorship, for instance, right? They are certainly not random networks, or at least random in this sense. The question is, are there other models now that can reproduce some of these properties? So let me just finish this and say, well, this didn't really match. This was a good match. Oh, that's what I'm saying. That this is the expected value of the clustering coefficient for Erdos-Renyi networks with the same number of links and the same average degree. Sorry. So this is the expected value. This is your null expectation. If your null expectation was the Erdos-Renyi type network with the same number of nodes and same number of links, the kind we were looking at. And what I meant for the diameters was also the same. If you look at Erdos-Renyi networks with the same number of nodes and the same number of links, your expected diameter turns out to be very close to the real diameters, but your expected clustering coefficient turns out to be much smaller. Any reason? Well, yeah, so it means that the structure of these networks, firstly, is not Erdos-Renyi, but in a specific way. It means that in a way that there are much more dense local links. So clustering coefficients are high. That means lots of neighbors of your neighbors are connected to each other in these ones. Whereas in a random graph, that's not the case. Erdos-Renyi graph, it's not the case. But in terms of path lengths, how long it takes to get from one place to another, it's about the same. It is like random. So what we'll do now is we'll try and proceed to other kinds of models of graphs. Yeah, you had a question. Is there a random graph out there naturally in the real world which one could compare with? Like an Erdos-Renyi? Yeah, maybe, yeah, if you did that. But yes? Sorry, correlations? Or coagulation? Yeah, so I guess if you took a process where you know that the dynamics is kind of random, and made a network out of it, I would expect that would be much closer. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So other kinds of models, and one of the questions now is, if we move away to other kinds of models of graphs, not necessarily even random graphs, but even graphs that are built by a dynamical process, can you get values that are much more similar? So that's what we're going to do. So we are going to talk about, for the rest of this class, I think we can cover a couple of different models. One is a set of models that rather famously became called as the small world networks. But it's a particular kind of model. I'll just get into it in a second. And the other is something called preferential attachment, which is a dynamical way of building networks using a certain kind of rule and a certain kind of stochastic process. And we'll see what kinds of properties they throw up for all these three quantities. Yeah. What it estimates well is the diameter or the average path length. That turns out to be actually a fairly good estimate and a fairly good command. The clustering is bad. Clustering is bad. Also, the degree distribution shape is not broad enough. The distributions are typically falling faster than exponentially as with degree for large degrees. Whereas in real networks, there are often nodes with very large degrees. So, I mean, by that I mean there are pages in the World Wide Web which are linked to 1,000 other pages, whereas there are other pages which are only linked to one other page. In an Erdős-Renyi network, that's rather unlikely. An Erdős-Renyi network, if the average degree was 10, then some nodes might be 20, maybe 30. Lots of nodes will be 1, 2, but there won't be anything 1,000. It's very unlikely, even for a very large network. But real networks do have that property. They have nodes that have very, very, very large number of links. Yeah. Yes. Certainly possible. It depends on the dynamical process. So what we'll do is, at the end of this class, come to one such dynamical process, and we'll have some estimates of what happens to the degree distribution there. But before I get to that, I want to talk about this other one, which is people call small world networks, but more appropriately, it's a set of models that two guys called Watts and Strogatz came up with. And essentially, it's an interpolation from what I will call a regular graph to an Erdős-Renyi graph. So on the one side, they start with what is called a regular graph. A regular graph is something like a lattice or a simple structure where every node is pretty much exactly the same as every other node. So it has the same number of neighbors, the symmetries around it are the same, and so on. In particular, they looked at a ring like this, where these were some of the links, and then there were additional links like that, like so. So this is a regular network of 6 nodes, and every node is connected to exactly 4 other nodes. So it's like nearest neighbors. You can extend this to a larger setting. You can talk about n nodes and k. So n nodes and k neighbors, right? Okay? So this is one end. What they do as they proceed from here is to change a single parameter, and they called it P, so I'm going to call it P, but don't get confused with the P of the Erdős-Renyi network. So if you are getting confused, tell me, I will change this notation. But I wanted to use this because this is what they use. So at one end, sorry? Oh, there's one more. Yes, correct. So this is a completely regular network. Every node is identical to every other node. If you relabel the nodes, you won't be able to tell. So this is at one end P. What P denotes as you increase P is they actually think of this as a stochastic process. They pick up a random link and with a probability P, rewire it randomly. So somewhere in between, you may have the same ring, but some of the nodes, so let's say some are okay, but maybe this link has been rewired. So let me actually put it back. Did I get 6? I'll put this back and then start rewiring. Okay, so maybe this one has been rewired. Let me draw the rewired links in a different color. Maybe this gets rewired over there. Maybe this one gets rewired to this one. Maybe this one goes away and this gets rewired. Okay? And the number of links that have been rewired depends on P. So this is P greater than 0. And at this end is P equals 1. And at this end, what you have is the same number of nodes, the same number of links as before, but they're just completely random. All of them have been rewired at least once. Right? Is the definition clear? So think of this, in fact, as a dynamical stochastic process, where as you increase P, you start rewiring links one by one. You rewire one link, then you rewire another, and you rewire another. And when I say rewire, I mean completely randomly. So you remove the link from the original graph, you pick 2 random nodes, and you put a link between them. Okay? One can talk about, what's the getting multiple links and self loops and so on. But in the limit they were interested in, which will again be n going to infinity, those processes are very rare, and one can actually show that this model, whether you allow self links or multiple edges or not, in that limit, the results are the same. Okay? Yes, so the number of links here and here and here are the same. Sorry, definition of? P. P tells you the probability that one of the original links was rewired. So on average for some P like this, essentially, roughly speaking, n squared P links would have been rewired. Sorry, no, I mean whatever was the original. So originally we had nk links, right? Because each node had a degree k. In this case, k was 4. So originally we had nk links. That means nkp links would have been rewired, and the rest would have remained. So there are versions of this model, since somebody asked the number of links is not changing. There is a version of this model where all the old links are kept and only new links are added with P. And they all turn out to be very similar results. Okay, so let's stick to this because it's easier to understand. Yeah. So this ends up being the Erdos-Renyi graph where we had a certain number of links and a certain number of nodes. Right? It is exactly the same. It's exactly the same. So in this limit, we should get exactly the same. Right. So here, what I'm calling K would, if you were looking at the P, this is the average degree. So it's exactly that. It's P by N. No. So here now, the number of neighbors would be different. Once you reach this limit, because links have been removed and then thrown back randomly, some nodes would have gotten lucky and got lots of, or larger number, some would have got no. It is certainly possible, for instance, for a node to have got no links. That's possible. It's possible for you to have had, I mean, I've not drawn the right number of links, but you might have had something like this with one node disconnected. That is possible. It depends on how many there are. Okay. Yes. Yes. So the number of links are not for, so we are only maintaining the total number of links, not the number of links per node. So we take a link, we pick a link, we remove it, and we throw it somewhere randomly. We pick another random link, throw it somewhere randomly, and so on. So you might, for a particular instance, have picked all of these 4 links, and they all got thrown somewhere else, and then this became disconnected. Okay? So of course, each instance that you produce, so now it's just like the ensemble of Erdos-Renyi random graphs. Each time you do this process, you will produce a different graph. So this is not a single, think of P non-zero as referring to not a single graph, but a whole ensemble of graphs each time you do this process. And what we will ask is things like, what is the average diameter, and so on. You had a question? Because you're talking about, yes. So let me say that. The reason he's saying this is, and it's absolutely correct, if each link contributes to the degree of 2 nodes. So n multiplied by k is actually the total degree. And each link contributes to 2 nodes degrees. So the actual number of links is by 2. Thanks very much. That 2 can be important sometimes when you're actually implementing these kind of things on the computer. You need to remember when you're comparing which ensemble you're comparing with, you need to get the number of links right. So nk by 2. Any other questions? Yes. That already have. Yeah. So there are 2 things you can do. And people have studied both versions of the model. There is a version where you can say, oh, if they already have a link, I will not put it there. I will find another random, and I'll keep finding until it satisfies this criteria. So no multi-edges is a constraint. People have also studied where they say versions of the model where they say, we don't care. Let it be multiple edges, that's fine. For small graphs with small numbers of n, that actually does matter, and you might get different results. But in the limit where n goes to infinity, you can show that that doesn't matter. Because the chance of that happening goes down sufficiently fast. So the chance of self-loops, the chance of multiple edges happening upon rewiring steadily goes to 0 as n goes to infinity, and fast enough that various quantities we're interested in will not be affected. So both models exist, but they're not too different. So we won't make that distinction. Is it clear what the model is and what the definition is? Just remember always that, of course, there is only one instance of a regular graph of this type, with the constraint that everything's on a ring and you're only connected to nearest neighbors. There is only one. If you were looking at all sorts of regular graphs, even this could be an ensemble. But over here, certainly, this is an ensemble, and so is this. Okay? So don't think of them as single graphs. Think of them as collections of graphs, each with a certain probability associated. So again, just like Erdos-Renyi graphs, it's a random graph ensemble, but with a particular probability distribution, not the Erdos-Renyi distribution. Okay, so on the one side, here we've already got some quantities, right? We said the diameter goes as log n by log k. We said the clustering coefficient goes as p, which in this case would be, what is it? K, I'll use k. K by n, right? And the degree distribution is Poisson. What are the same quantities on this end? What do you think the diameter will go like? If it's easier for you to imagine, just imagine a ring without all these extra. So you want to know what's the longest, shortest path on a ring, and how will that scale as n? N by 2, because it's a ring. But you know, if it was a line, you would be right. Because it's a ring, it's something like n by 2. Okay? So it certainly, but either way, whether it was a ring or just a straight line, it would scale with n, right? What if it was, we can think about other kinds of networks. What if it was a 2-dimensional lattice which was linked like, like this? What would it be? Square root of n, right? So in general, for a d-dimensional regular lattice, it'll go something like n to the power 1 over d. Right? That's just, is everyone clear with that? So diameter goes as n. I'll leave out the the nodes. What happens when you have extra neighbors? Well, what really happens is that it makes some of the distances shorter, but the scaling doesn't really change. So it becomes something like n by k, I believe, right? Isn't that what it would be? Let me just make sure I have not. Yeah, it'll become n by k. So if you want to also take the k into account, it'll be something like this. Okay, what about clustering coefficient? Well, you can see for a graph like this, or a graph like this, actually, let's look at the neighbors. There's, I'm not sure I drew this properly, but there will be links like that, right? So if you have a neighbor, and you have a neighbor on that side, what's the chance that they're connected? Depends on k. But if k is large enough, if k is not just 1 or 2, then you will have that. Okay, so in fact, a fair fraction of your neighbors will be connected. You can actually check this out. For something like this, I'll give you the answer, and it turns out to be 3k minus 1 by 4k minus 2. Or I might have written that the other way around. Yeah, I have written the other way around. K minus 2, k minus 1. I mean, we can check this out for, say, this case. This is n, well, n doesn't matter. K is 1, 2, 3, 4. So I would predict 3 multiplied by 2, 4 multiplied by 3, which would be half. So let's check that out for one of the nodes. Let's say this is the node I'm interested in, and it has this neighbor, this neighbor, this neighbor, and this neighbor. There are 4 neighbors, so you could have 4C2 connections, right? Which would be 6. So there are potentially 6 pairs of neighbors who could be connected. And how many of those neighbors are actually connected? There's this one, there's this one, and there's that one. So there are 3. Is there another? Right, so let's see, did I get this right? 4C2, 4, 3, 2, yeah, so this was correct. So there should be 6, and this pair is connected, so that's one pair. This pair is connected, that's another pair. This pair is connected, that's another pair. That pair is connected. So that's 4, sorry. So 4, so actually that came out to be 3 by 2. 4 out of 6, so 4 out of 6. I've done something wrong in the calculation. Maybe it was 1 over 2. Would that give the correct thing? Of course, yeah, in a bigger ring, they wouldn't be connected. So there might be an n dependence here. I think this is the case when n goes to infinity. Thank you. That's probably it. Thanks for spotting that. So this is a small graph, so there's a finite n correction that should be coming here. But if it was a very, very large graph, then that would be the case. Thanks. Okay, so in any case, I mean, you can see that when k is large and n is large, this would essentially be something like 3 by 4. It's large. It's sort of on the same order as these kinds of numbers. It's certainly not on the order of 10 to the minus 4, 10 to the minus 5, the kind of things you would get over here. So now we need to understand what happens in between, right? So it's actually, some of the calculation is hard. People know some of this in detail, and some of this they only know numerically. But numerically, this is what they found. And then we'll come to try and understand a little bit of why this result is sensible. So what these guys, Watson, Strogatz, plotted was P going from 0 to 1. And they'll call this, D0, the value expected for the regular graph, and they call this C0. And they call this D of P and C of P. So what they plotted was, firstly, dP divided by D0. So relative to the regular graph, what would be your diameter? So obviously, at p equals 0, they're the same, so they start here. And it turns out, so what I'm actually going to plot here is let me plot a log p. So we are looking actually at something like 10 to the minus 5, 10 to the minus, or was it 10 to the minus 4? Yeah. Minus 3, 10 to the minus 2, 10 to the minus 1. If you plot it on a log curve, this actually goes down fairly steeply and then comes down some way to a low value. This is, of course, the value d1 by d0. And you can estimate how much that is. So that's log n by n. So this is a value that goes as log n by n. And they chose something large enough. They had, I forget what were the sizes, but they were pretty large. They were 10,000 nodes or something like that. So this came down fairly low, and that starts up very high. The clustering coefficient showed an interesting behavior. So the second thing they plotted was C of P by C of 0. That remained pretty much flat all the way up to here and then comes down. And again, the value down here would be C of 1 by C of 0. And we know what that is. That's going to be something like K by N divided by something that was more or less a constant. So overall, the scaling was 1 over N. So the interesting thing about this is the random graph, remember this is the limit in which you're in the Erdos Renyi. The clustering is small, the diameter is small. In regular graphs, both are relatively high. The clustering is high, the diameter scales as N. So relative at least to the Erdos Renyi, it's high. The interesting thing here was there was a fairly large range of p-values where your path lengths were more like the Erdos Renyi random graph. That is, diameters were pretty small, they were scaling as log n, whereas the clustering coefficient was like a regular graph. So if one takes a graph somewhere here, a p-value that's somewhere there, you can see, so if I wrote Watts and Strogatz, you would see that it could give you a high clustering coefficient and a small diameter. So we've done a little bit better. We've done one step better. Okay. This curve is actually quite easy to understand because the clustering is just is rather straightforward to see that what's going to happen is you're going to be disrupting clusters and contributions to the clustering coefficient by rewiring, right? If there was a triangle, that contributes to the clustering coefficient, right? We have, remember, the clustering coefficient was you look at the neighbors of a given node, you're interested in this node, and you ask how many of those neighbors are connected. So that's really to do with triangles. Anytime you disrupt a triangle, you are reducing the clustering coefficient. So if I rewired this link, then that triangle is disrupted, and you no longer have your two neighbors knowing each other. So anything that can disrupt a triangle is going to bring down the clustering coefficient. In order to keep a triangle intact, you need 3 links to remain unrewired, right? So the chance of that happening is something like 1 minus p multiplied by 1 minus p multiplied by 1 minus p. Yes? So the clustering coefficient, actually, with some small corrections, goes pretty much like C of 0, 1 minus p cubed. And that's why essentially it takes a while for the p to kick in and for the clustering coefficient to start falling. Okay? I am not giving you a full rigorous argument here, admittedly. It's somewhat hand-waving, but I want to give you the intuition. So why is a triangle a contribution to the clustering coefficient? Because a triangle is precisely a structure where 2 neighbors of a node are connected to each other. And any such triangle will add to the clustering coefficient. So anytime you disrupt a triangle in a graph anywhere, for the clustering coefficient of the whole graph, it will come down. So there is a sort of a one-to-one relationship between the number of triangles and the clustering coefficient. And all we're asking is, what's the chance of disrupting triangles when you're removing this? The reason this is not a completely rigorous argument is because sometimes a single link could be part of multiple triangles. And that's where a correction will come here, because rewiring a single link could rewire multiple triangles and sometimes bring down the clustering coefficient a lot. But if it's a triangle that's not next to other triangles or not sharing edges with other triangles, then it won't. That's why this is sort of an approximation. But it's a remarkably decent approximation for large N. Okay? I'll put up some literature where you can look at the original papers here and some other work that has been done on these kind of networks where they do more rigorous calculations. So that's some understanding of this. The understanding of this is a little harder to come by, but intuitively you can imagine some of what's happening. So since, let's actually think about a large N situation. So we are talking about a big ring, a ring that's, sort of, let me see, is that the right? It only doesn't look like a cubic graph because I've drawn it on a log scale. So it does end up being quite a lot like a cubic graph. A cubic graph will look a lot like this if you do it on a log. There are some corrections, but it is a valid question to ask at what point those corrections are large. And they are large, I guess the logic would be they are large when lots of triangles are interacting. And that would be the case when actually there are many links. When it's a dense graph, you're likely to have those kind of connections. Okay, so let's try and get an understanding of this. So imagine a very large one, and imagine that you now have some of these connections. And unlike that very small graph I had drawn, you can see that it really does take a long time to get to the other end. But what's going to happen as you start rewiring is you'll build shortcuts. And it could well happen, these are random links. So the question is, how often does a random link cut across a large section of the network and thereby bring all those nodes together? So every time there is a new random link put up, the question is, what's the probability that it's actually only being rewired to somewhere close by? Let's say it's somewhere here. Or is it being rewired all the way across? And when you imagine a very, very large ring, you can imagine that a lot of rewirings will actually happen pretty far away. And one can actually do this argument a little more rigorously and try and actually calculate what's the chance that the rewiring would bring a node that was earlier n by 2 away, close by, and so on. It turns out it's a little hard to do that calculation. I'm not even sure I can do it off the fly on a board like this. But it turns out that it's very rapid. The first few links bring together nodes that are typically, on average, pretty far away in a regular graph. And so the average path length really drops very quickly. The question really is, what's useful and important to ask over here is, we know, as I said over here, D of P in this region, D of P scales as log n. In this region, because it's a regular graph, D of P scales as n. And that's something that's been numerically checked. So essentially, somewhere along the way, the scaling is changing from where the diameter scales and diverges proportional to n to something where it diverges, but only proportional to log n. So the question is, where does this crossover happen? And that's the hard calculation, but that's a calculation. So I'm not going to do it, but I will tell you what happens. And it happens essentially at something like P star, which itself depends on n, in this way, n to the power d, where d is the dimension. So roughly speaking, the effect of that is that we can write down the diameter as something like this. The diameter scales as something like 1 over d by k, some universal function p k n to the power d. So in our case, I mean, let's just think about the ring. It'll be easier to understand. It's something like n by k, some function of p k n. And this function f of x, has the property that it scales as x for x, x much less than 1, and it scales as log x as for x much larger than 1. Sorry, log x by x. There's one n that comes out over there. So this scaling relation, d is the dimension. So people have, I should re-mention that. Here, this is a sort of a one-dimensional ring. So it's a one-dimensional regular graph with every node having k neighbors. So as for a one-dimensional graph, essentially all that means is really the dimension really shows up in the diameter. How does the diameter scale with n? In a one-dimensional graph, just think of a straight line. As you increase the number of nodes, the lengths, all lengths basically increase with n. If you had a lattice, a two-dimensional lattice, as you scale up the number of nodes, the lengths increase only as the square root. So in general, for a d-dimensional lattice, this would be 1 over d. Well, yes, I mean, I think you can describe certain kinds of lattices as fractional, but it's somewhat hard to think of a regular lattice as a thing. So if we stick to regular lattices, it's easier to just think about, one dimension. But don't get too confused about the dimension. If you want, just think about these rings that we have been thinking about. And essentially, this is the scaling that happens. So this is something that describes a crossover where for small values of p, you're in the regime where all the scaling is being given by this. All the n dependence comes here. Whereas if you're in large values of p, this log x by x comes, the x cancels out, the n cancels out there, and you get a log n dependence. So this is something that has been extensively checked numerically. It has also, there are analytical arguments, but none of the arguments are absolutely watertight. People, let's put it this way, it's almost certain that this is what's going on. There's a lot of numerical evidence, and there are fairly good, but not absolutely watertight analytical arguments that suggest this, and many different arguments that people have brought out to suggest this. People have used everything from branching theory to aggregation and all sorts of different tools that you actually find in statistical mechanics, and suggested that the scaling must be like this. But there isn't an actual completely watertight analytical proof. Nevertheless, I think the numerical evidence is really so strong that I think we can say we have a fairly good understanding of what's happening here. And the bottom line is, over here, you have a regular graph, and distances scale as n, and it very quickly, with very few shortcuts, very few rewirings, it becomes something like a random graph. Yeah. Exactly. I think that's a very good way of saying it. Essentially, for a large network, you don't need to rewire very much at all. Even a single rewiring really brings you very close to parts of the graph that are very far away, and that's good enough. And if every node has one such shortcut, you're done. You'll probably find your way across the graph very, very quickly. Okay? Any questions about this? Of course. So the question is, you're rewiring a few nodes, but not others. So of course, as P increases, you start rewiring many, many nodes. So eventually you're going to get to the random limit where you have rewired. You are now close to some nodes, you're far away from other nodes. But even in that case, where you have completely rewired everything, we know it scales as log n, because from the Erdos-Renyi calculation. So we know that the worst, even if you get away from some nodes and come closer to others and completely mess up the whole thing, you're still going to be only log n. In this regime, though, it's easier to understand. In this regime, you're still close to the ones you're close to, but you've got shortcuts to things far away. Okay, so it's a very nice one-parameter kind of series of models that takes you from a regular thing to the Erdos-Renyi. And it looks like real networks, at least in some features, are lying somewhere in between over here. Yes, you had a question. Sorry. Okay. So, any more questions about these small world networks, or to be more accurate, what's Strogatz networks? So we've seen that they had large clustering coefficients and small diameters, which was a bit better than what we got with the Erdos-Renyi. But what about the degree distribution? Any guesses? I mean, there's already enough information here for you to guess whether there are fat tails or not. You know the degree distribution on that side. That's Poisson. What's the degree distribution here? Sorry, say aloud. It's a delta function, right? So you're going from something that on this side, a degree distribution that's very sharply peaked, to something over there where it's not as sharply peaked, but you know it's a Poisson, and you know it goes down faster than exponential. We did this. So what's likely to happen in between? I mean, this is going way faster than exponential. That's going faster than exponential. You're not going to get fat tails in between. Okay? So we're not going to actually do a calculation. I don't know how to actually calculate the degree distribution here. Probably one can, because it's really random rewiring. So one could calculate the probability that a node gets a few extra links and so on. But I've never done that calculation myself. I think it's sufficient to follow your intuition here to think that the degree distribution must be fairly smoothly going from this limit to that limit. And if in both limits you're falling faster than exponential, you're not ever going to have fat tails. So this is still not working. Right? We so far haven't encountered any process that produces a graph, or any, whether random or stochastic or not, that produces fat tails. So what I wanted to do in the rest of today is to tell you about one such process. There are, by now, people have studied many different dynamical processes, stochastic, deterministic, and even certain kinds of random graph ensembles that do produce power law distributions, fat tails for the degree distribution. I will talk about only one of them because we don't have time to go through everything. Any more questions about this? Otherwise, I'll rub this and move on to that. Yeah. How many of your non-friends are non-friends? Sure, I guess you can. Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure that's related to the clustering coefficient. You can probably just pull it off directly. Maybe it's 1 minus c. Maybe it's not 1 minus c. I don't know. Yeah. No, sure. I mean, that's perfectly valid way of. Yeah, it's probably just 1 minus that. You think it's like C? Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. And there are lots of your nodes. Sure. Especially in the large n limit, it probably is. In a small n limit, there might be some combinatorial factors that come in. Who knows? Okay. Any others? Can I rub all this, or do you want me to leave some of it on? Okay. I'm going to rub all of this and have a clean start for a process that people have called preferential attachment. Some of you would have already heard about this. It's as a method to produce networks with these fat tails. It kind of gained prominence in the 90s with the same guy, Barabasi. But actually, if you dig into the history of it, those guys, Barabasi and Albert, produced this preferential attachment model in the 90s. and it produced these networks with these fat tails. But 20 years before that, there was a guy called Price who had done exactly the same thing. It just wasn't called preferential attachment, and it was forgotten, and then they rediscovered it. And then 20 years before that, there was a guy called Simon who did it in a slightly different context, but it's really the same model. And then 20 years before him, there was a guy called Yule who did this exactly the same thing, except in the context of a population dynamics model. So, you know, this is a concept that's been rediscovered about 5 times. And maybe in another, so I think it was 99 or something, so let's say 2000. It's about time it's rediscovered again. Huh? So you just need to name it something slightly different and catchy, and it'll come back. But the method is a neat one, and it's well worth knowing. Okay, I can stop here. So we're going to talk about preferential attachment. The name already gives it away. I think you can guess. For those of you who haven't seen it before, you can pretty much guess what's going to happen. So this is going to be a dynamic process, slightly different from the kind of dynamical process we've seen producing networks, because here I will initially start with a small network. You know, when the initial condition, when you actually try and implement this process, might matter a bit for small networks, but it won't matter much. So you could start with this, you could start with a single node, don't worry too much about it. But let's just start with something, just so I can explain the concept. So let me start with a network like this. At every time step, I'm going to add a new node. And a new node will be given a single link. But the single link will be given, so there'll be a link coming out of here, and it'll either go to this one or this one or this one, any of the previous nodes. And that choice will be made stochastically with a certain probability. And the probability that it attaches to a given node is proportional to the degree of that node, the degree before. So let's just look at this. This is the new node. This has a degree 1, this has a degree 2, this has a degree 1. So the probability that this is the link is going to be what? 1 divided by 1 by 4. Yes? Because the probability that you will link to this is 2 by 4, and the probability that you link to this is also 1 by 4. So one of these links will show up, and with these probabilities. And only one link will be put. So let's say you ended up picking this. Yeah? Sometimes you'll pick a less likely link. But most often when something comes in, now this has a degree 2, this has a degree 1, and a new node comes in. What's the total degree? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you will have 2 by 6, 2 by 6, 1 by 6, 1 by 6. Let's assume you actually this time link to one of these large ones, right? Now the degree becomes 3. So you can see, as things go on, the nodes that already have a large degree will get more links, and they'll get larger degrees. Therefore, in the next turn, they will have a higher probability of getting a link, and so on. So this is very much a rich get richer type of process. Right? If you already have links, the chance that you'll get more links is higher. So now we need to understand what would happen to the degree distribution in the limit n going to infinity. Once we added lots and lots of nodes using this process, what is the degree distribution going to look like? So let me ask, any questions about this process? Is it clear what you're doing? Yeah. Depends. So let's think about, so of course, the node that has the largest thing is likely to accumulate more, but once in a while, other things will get it. That's exactly what we need to ask. But remember, I mean, the probabilities, we were calculating the total degree and then dividing the degree by the total degree. How much does the total degree increase? So let's get an understanding of that. So we need to ask, we're going to write this down as a dynamical process. We're going to say new nodes come in at a certain rate, okay, with their links. Fine? And that rate is, I'm going to say that the rate at which the new node comes in, rate of introduction of nodes, and therefore links, is going to be 1 per unit time. So I'm going to try and write down an equation for how does the probability that a node has a degree k change with time. Okay? So imagine there are n nodes with degree k at some given time. Let me actually put the time like this. What I want to write down is an equation like this. Some of you may be familiar with this kind of an equation. It's, you can think of it as a master equation. Any of you are familiar with master equations for stochastic processes? This is a master equation. N is the number of nodes with degree k at time t. All right? So there are two processes that affect this number nk. A node can become a node with degree k either by, the only way it can become a node of degree k is if it was a node of degree k minus 1 and the new node linked to it, right? That's the only way you could create a node of degree k which was not there before. So if you wanted to look at processes that increase n of k, the only way they can come from is from k minus 1. Yes? So I'm going to write down, so we need something like a probability to jump from k minus 1 to k. And I'm going to write this as the probability for that, multiplied by the number of nodes which have k minus 1. Okay? What are processes that will reduce the number of nodes that have k degrees, a degree k? No. The number, not the fraction. So, yes, got a new link. So it's sort of the converse of this. You have the same kind of probability, but except it'll be something like this, right? So this is the probability that a node already with degree k gets a new link. And therefore it becomes a node of degree k plus 1, right? Everyone happy with this? So there are processes, it's the same process. The process that you're doing is adding a link. That will cause some of the nodes of degree k minus 1 to become k, and some nodes of degree k to become k plus 1. And that's what I'm putting down here. But there's one more term which needs to be added. Anybody guess what that is? No, so let's assume it only has one link. You can do the same model, but give it m links, and it'll change this a little bit. You'll have to add other terms, or you'll have to put k minus m. If m is a fixed number, it'll be k minus m, and this term will go and affect the k plus m. But you can handle that. Let's stick with the simple case of just adding one link. There's one more term that needs to be added. So think about whether this is a valid equation for k equals 0, or sorry, let's say k equals 1. Yeah, there are some nodes with, maybe initially, or somewhere along the process, there'll be a node with degree 1. When a new node comes in, so if you already have a graph like this, let's say you've already linked to some things and then some other stuff is linked here and so on. Right? There are various nodes with degree 1. When a new node comes in, yes, it could link to that, and that could become degree 2. But there's no node of degree 0. So this term will not be there. Right? So if you were actually writing down the equation, so this is only valid for k greater than 1. If you were writing down the term for this, well, yes, you can put in, let me drop this out. you can put in the negative term over there, minus P1 N1T. But there is one more term here. There is, yes, so whenever you add a node, that's the only process that creates a new node with degree 1. Agreed? So if you think about an existing network, which has nodes of degree 1, 2, 3, 1000, how would you add to the number of nodes that has degree 1? There's no way to do that. It'll remain either exactly the same, or one of the nodes will go away and become a node of degree 2. The only thing that adds to that value is the new node that comes in. And every time a new node comes in, the way we've defined it, it has degree 1, right? So here, there is a term that will add to the degrees, but it's just a constant, because we are putting in new nodes at a rate 1. Yeah? So if you want, I could just make this valid for everything if I just added a delta, Kronecker delta. Yes? You agree? So any confusion about the terms? This equation should describe the entire behavior of the system. And we're going to start with some initial conditions. So there will be some initial n of k at time 0. And then you'll start this process, and it will develop according to this. And we want to ask what happens in the large time limit. Yeah? So we need to define P of k and P of k minus 1. Okay? So I'm going to say, so P of k, in the way I defined it, where I said that the new node is proportional to the degree, is simply going to be, so I'm going to generalize this a bit. I said it could be proportional. That was one choice. In principle, I could have easily said, oh, it's proportional to the square of the degree, right? In which case, this new node that comes in would have got what? It would have got 2 squared by some normalization, 2 squared by some normalization, 1 squared by some normalization, 1 squared by some normalization. It's a perfectly valid rule. We don't know what it'll give, but it's certainly valid to think of a rule like this, right? And the normalization would be got by just adding up all of these. So in general, if you say that there is a certain rate at which you will add links that depends on the degree, so let me call that A of k, and that's some, let's say, some increasing function of k, then I could just simply define, put the appropriate normalization as follows. So this is going to be AK NK. Yeah? Agreed? So I'm going to put that in over here so that we don't get further confused. Let's write this down. AK minus 1, A, K by A, where A is defined as follows. Okay? Yes? K degrees, K links, K connections, no problem. Absolutely. So the only way they can decrease is if they become larger degrees, if they add connections to themselves. So let's say you're talking about nodes of degree 2. When you have when you start with a small graph, maybe one link comes in, another comes in, then the number of nodes of degree 2 is increasing initially. But eventually those 2 nodes become 3, and maybe there's very little probability of new nodes with degree 2 coming because all the new links are coming into the higher and higher nodes. So it's certainly possible. Not necessarily, no. I wouldn't say that's true. So it depends. So you can set up initial conditions where you can get all sorts of situations, okay? So depending on the initial graph, you may be able to set up the initial graph such that it will be monotonic, but there will be certain initial graphs, depending on their size and how you distributed the degrees amongst them, where a particular degree, let's say a degree 3 nodes, could initially go up and then go down, or go down and then go up, or go monotonically. That transient behavior is going to be very dependent on the initial conditions. The long-term behavior, although, is not. So for a system like this, what we will try to discuss is the very long time behavior. Once n has become very large, lots of time has passed, lots of new nodes have been added, then it's possible, rather straightforwardly, to understand what happens to this equation. Okay? So we're going to be more interested in that state than in what happens very close to time 0, where only the first few have been added. But by all means, try and explore this. If you play with this on a computer, try out different initial conditions and see whether you can find initial conditions which make things go up and down. So, yes, there were at time t, this is correct. At time t, there were n nodes, n k minus 1 t nodes with degree k minus 1. The probability that the new link, essentially the probability that the new link that's added will get added to one of those k minus 1 degree nodes. There are nodes of all sorts of degrees, right? And therefore, that's why the total rate is going to be summed over this. That's why this normalization has to come in. So the normalization takes into account the entire degree distribution. So, of course, the probability that a particular node does get a link does depend on what other nodes there are and what their degrees are. And that comes in over here. So I'm writing it in this general way because actually, for a fairly wide class of functions, AK, you can solve this analytically. So we shouldn't be just restricted to the one case that I did mention initially, which was this. This was the case that I talked about first when I was describing the process. But actually, you can solve this. And in general, we'll be interested in k to the power gamma. And we'll be interested in all sorts of gamma values over here. But think of it, to get a rich get richer type of phenomenon, you do need this to be an increasing function. Otherwise, it's not a rich get richer. If you have a decreasing function, that's a completely different kind of thing. Well, it's still preferential, I suppose. You could still call it preferential attachment. It's preferential in the other way. We're going to be interested in increasing functions. And to begin with, let's build intuition using the example I gave earlier, which was AK is equal to K. And once we built intuition for that linear case, then we can try and go ahead and maybe not in this class, but in the next class. But I think in this class, we can at least get some distance into the linear calculation. So let's take the case where AK is equal to K. Let's think about the first few equations over here, right? So let's begin by thinking about this. If AK is equal to K, firstly, the total A is this, right? I've just replaced AK by K. What's this quantity on the right-hand side? It's the sum over all degrees. So it's the total degree. So if you took the degree of every node, added it up, it's the total degree, right? As somebody pointed out earlier, that's twice the number of links. So how is this going to grow with time? So A is, of course, a function of t. So every time you add a link, how much does the total degree increase by? 2, right? So basically, essentially, dA by dt, the rate at which A increases is 2. Yeah? So in the long t limit, A of t is going to go as 2t. Why am I hand waving that? It's because there is an initial condition. And of course, there could be some constant and so on. When you actually integrate this, it'll be 2t plus a constant. The constant could depend on the initial graph you use. But in the long time limit, it's going to be very, very close to 2t. So A goes as t. So given that, let's try to write these equations out a bit. Let's try and look at the first few equations to get some sense of what will happen. So let's say dn1 n1t by dt. What's that? That was 1 minus a1 by 2t n1t, right? A1 is just 1. Yeah, AK is K over here. So this is the equation. Any guesses as to how n1t will go? This is a straightforward, simple differential equation. Although there is a t dependence over here, you should still be able to solve it. So it turns out, I mean, don't worry, we have only a couple of minutes left. So let me skip trying to let you guess the solution and tell you that it's actually going to go n1t is going to go proportional to time. And I'll tell you what the actual, it's actually going to be 2t by 3. Let's just make sure the left-hand side will be 2 by 3. The right-hand side will be 1 minus 2t by 3 divided by 1 over 2t, which is equal to 1 minus 1 over 3, which is 2 by 3. Yeah? So, okay. All right? That's just a quick check. You should check it yourself. Don't believe me. But it goes proportional to time. So we know how n1 is going. Let's try n2. This is going to be n1 of t by 2t minus 2 times n2 of t by 2t. Okay, we know what this is. This is 2 by 3, 2t by 3. So that's going to cancel out. So this is going to be 1 by 3 minus something. You can see that it's not that different from the first equation. The constants have changed a bit, but you have one constant that's positive, and the negative term is proportional to that with another constant divided by 2t. So it turns out that that too actually has a solution where it's proportional to time. And the solution is n2t is equal to, in this case, t by 6. You can check, you should also check that, and so on. So if you write down the equation for n3t, you'll find exactly the same thing. Once you plug in n2, you're going to divide by 2t, and you'll get a very similar equation. And it looks like, at least just intuitively, all the n's are growing with t. So let's assume that. I won't take very much more time. Give me a few minutes, and this calculation will be done. So let's assume nkt is some small nk, which has no time dependence, multiplied by time. We can now take this relation and plug it in over there. Yes? So we'll get, in the end, a relation between n of k. So when you plug it in on this side, you'll get nk. And on that side, you'll get some nk. And that side, you'll get also some, here you'll get some nk minus 1. And there you'll get nk. So essentially, you'll get some kind of recursion relation. So nk, it turns out, will be, it's rather easy. It's rather a very neat, simple thing that you'll get. K minus 1 divided by k plus 2. Somebody wants to do this in more detail, we can do this. We know already that n1 is 2 by 3. We just solved that, right? So n1 is 2 by 3. Once you know n1, you can calculate n2. Once you know n2, the same equation gives you n3, and so on. And it turns out this is rather easy to do. So if you want, we can do this in the tutorial, or you can try it yourself. It's not very hard. And you'll figure out that n of k has the very simple relation k plus 1, k plus 2. And how does that go for the large k limit? 1 over k cubed. So notice that this is the degree distribution, right? Why is that the case? I said small nk is nk divided by t. But t is just the same as n, capital N, the total number of nodes. Every times the rate at which we're adding nodes is 1 per unit time, right? So t is the same also as n. So if you were asking the probability of finding a node with degree k, That's simply the number of nodes with degree k divided by the total number of nodes. So this quantity is actually the degree distribution. So what we proved is that for ak is equal to k, in the long time limit, when you've made the graph really large, you will finally, we have one model at least, that gives us, so let me call this the Barabasi-Albert model, although there are many others who have done this. Here, we finally have something where the degree distribution goes as a power law. So it's a fat tail and a power law, and it has an exponent 3. Okay? So at least we have this. Very quickly, let me just tell you, and then I'll end. It turns out for this model, for exactly this linear attachment rate, that this goes as something like n to the 3 by 4. This is not an analytical calculation. This is purely numerical. I don't think anybody has really, people have got bounds on the clustering coefficient for the graphs produced by this method, but nobody has got an analytical calculation, but it looks, if you run it, this is something you can also check, you get something like this. And the diameter goes as something like log n, and there's a double log correction. This people do have some analytical handle on. We're not going to get into it. We're not going to try and prove that. But I just want you to know. So this is kind of small. This gives you a fat tail. But the clustering coefficient is still pretty small. It's not as small as the Erdos-Renyi. The Erdos-Renyi goes down with size as 1 over n. This goes a little bit slower, but it's still fast enough that it doesn't explain some of the real networks. So finally, we now have something that has the right this, but it does not have the right clustering coefficient. Okay? So let me, at that point, stop. If you have any immediate questions, we can answer it. Otherwise, you can also ask me questions in the tutorial. Yeah. I'm here for the tutorial, at least the beginning. So.